Thank you very much, Cora, for that kind introduction, and thank you, Ed. It's a huge pleasure for me to be here in Manila. This is my very first visit to the Philippines, I'm embarrassed to say, but I'm very happy to be here, and I wanted to thank the Makati Business Club, the Management Association of the Philippines, and AmCham for the opportunity to put together such an amazing event. And thanks to all of you for coming out today to talk about the current trends in U.S. trade policy in Asia, and particularly with the Philippines. The real celebrity, though, here today is somebody whom you know very well. It's your ambassador to the Philippines, Joey Cuisha. It's really because of him that I'm here. Every time I see him in Washington, he says to me, "When are you coming to Manila? When are you coming to Manila?" And I just can't face him again in Washington. So he has been largely instrumental for getting me here. And he, as you know, is an extraordinarily effective advocate for the interests of the Philippines back in Washington. And I'm very proud to know him. And it's great to be able to see him in the context of all of his friends here today. So once more, let's give your ambassador to the United States a warm round of applause. I also wanted to recognize our Deputy Chief of Mission here today, Leslie Bassett, who works and heads a team of incredible and extraordinary professionals at the U.S. Embassy here, who represent our interests here in the Philippines extraordinarily well. I wanted to thank Leslie very much for arranging such a terrific visit for me and the embassy team here. Thank you. A well-known Tagalog proverb says, "A person needs to remember where he came from in order to get where he wants to go." When considering the future of the trade and economic relationship between the United States and the Philippines, this saying rings true. The United States and the Philippines are firm allies and historic partners, united by a shared history, a common language, and extensive linkages between our peoples. Our abiding friendship has been forged by a history of shared sacrifice and common purpose, and enriched by the presence of more than 4 million Filipinos and Filipino Americans in the United States, and over 150,000 Americans here in the Philippines. Our soldiers have fought valiantly together in places like Corregidor, Bataan, and Leyte. The American Chamber of Commerce in the Philippines symbolizes the depth of our connections. The first U.S. chamber overseas, established in 1902 and incorporated in 1920, it has been active in promoting American interests and commercial linkages in the Philippines for more than 100 years. The magnitude of our trading relationship further underscores these close connections. Our two-way trade has grown over decades to $22 billion worth of two-way trade in 2011, comprising $17 billion in goods and $5 billion in services. In 2010, our two-way stock of foreign direct investment was $7 billion. The Philippines has also become a leading beneficiary of the Generalized System of Preferences program, with roughly $1 billion worth of Philippines goods exports entering the United States duty-free every year. President Obama's goal is to not only strengthen and improve our trading relationship with the Philippines to enhance our nation's prosperity, but he also views our engagement as a key part of his broader strategy to increase America's engagement in and focus on the Asia-Pacific region. However, if you compare the trade statistics I just mentioned to what's happening more broadly in the region, you will see a somewhat disconcerting trend. In the past 5 years, the bilateral trade relationship between the United States and the Philippines has not kept up with others in the Asia-Pacific region. In fact, our trade in goods has declined slightly in both absolute and relative terms. In 2008, the United States was the Philippines' largest trading partner, Now, several years after entry into force of the Japan-Philippines Economic Partnership Agreement, Japan holds that top spot. And as a result of the Philippines' preferential trade relationships with China and Korea, your trade with those countries is increasing rapidly as well. While $22 billion in annual two-way trade is a lot, the overall trend is not what we want to see with one of our oldest and closest relationships. What we want is simple. We want to regain our place as the Philippines' #1 trading partner and stay there for years to come. While keeping these trends in mind, my overall message today is one of optimism. Optimism because today we have a golden opportunity to recapture the momentum in our trade relationship, expand the commercial linkages between our two countries, and modernize the underpinnings of our historic engagement so that it better reflects trade and investment in the 21st century. Let me share with you 3 reasons why we're so optimistic. First, the United States and the Philippines are engaging in dynamic and energized bilateral discussions. Led by my boss, the U.S. Trade Representative, Ambassador Ron Kirk, and Secretary of Trade and Industry, Greg Domingo, our trade officials have met frequently and have held productive talks on new initiatives and new avenues for cooperation. These efforts are already bearing fruit. At last November's APEC meetings in Honolulu, we signed a Customs Administration and Trade Facilitation Agreement with the Philippines, demonstrating our two countries' shared commitment to simplified, transparent customs procedures so that trade can flow freely without unexpected and unnecessary delays. Both because of its substance and the momentum that it gives to our discussions, this agreement is an extremely important step. Second, we are assisting the Aquino administration's efforts to fight corruption and to create the right conditions for sustained, broad-based economic growth, including through President Aquino's 5-year development plan. If done well, implementation of the development plan will enhance the economic performance of the Philippines and will make the Philippine economy a more attractive place for trade and investment. As part of these efforts, we applaud the Philippines' leadership as one of 8 founding governments of the Open Government Partnership launched last September in New York. Under this partnership, the Aquino administration committed to a global initiative for more transparent, more effective, and more accountable governance. These steps are important in light of the clear, direct, and positive correlation between improved governance and transparency and the creation of a better environment for economic growth and job creation. The United States strongly supports these policies through President Obama's new paradigm for development assistance. As many of you know, the Philippines is one of only 4 countries in the world and the only country in Asia in the Partnership for Growth program, which we call the PFG. The PFG prioritizes economic growth in countries committed to good governance. Under the PFG, our two governments have agreed on a statement of principles and a 5-year program of activities that supports key objectives of the Aquino administration's development plan, including measures aimed at fostering a more open and competitive business environment, strengthening laws and regulations, and supporting fiscal stability through improved expenditure and revenue management. The third thing we're working on is we're working with the Philippines to confront long-standing challenges in our bilateral trade relationship. For example, we support the new and potentially significant efforts underway in the Philippines to improve the protection and enforcement of intellectual property rights. In the past, a substandard environment for intellectual property rights has been a competitive drag on the Philippine economy and an important reason why your economic performance has lagged that of other countries. Widespread piracy and counterfeiting and weaknesses in enforcement, including the slow process of prosecuting IPR cases in the Philippine court system, have been issues of long-standing concern to both U.S. and Filipino stakeholders. While the challenges are significant, we applaud the efforts underway to improve the situation, including the Supreme Court's recent issuance of new rules to improve the handling of intellectual property rights cases in the court system. This is a very important step in the right direction. We are also very interested in the copyright legislation that's currently before the Philippine Senate and scheduled for a final reading next month. After more than a decade in process, passage of this important legislation would send a strong signal that the Philippines is motivated to improve its IPR environment and join a growing number of countries which are taking steps to nurture creativity and innovation in the 21st century economy. In addition, we have high hopes that through our increased bilateral engagement, we will resolve some other significant irritants in our trade relationship, including serious issues affecting our meat trade that I hope to discuss tomorrow with Secretary Alcala. During this trip, I will also continue discussions with government officials that Secretary Baldos and I had in Washington last month on efforts the Aquino administration is taking to address long-standing concerns about the protection of worker rights, including addressing violence against labor leaders. So I arrive in Manila with great optimism about the future direction of our trade relationship, and I look forward to my discussions with Secretary Domingo, Secretary Purisima, Secretary Alcala, and others. Beyond these ongoing efforts, we have a shared interest in elevating our engagement and a common desire to shape initiatives that will help grow trade and investment in the 21st century. Now, it is up to us to take advantage of the tremendous opportunity that this moment presents. Some of you may know that before coming to Manila, I traveled to Vietnam and Brunei for discussions on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or TPP. Let me take a moment to bring you up to date on TPP, which many of you know is President Obama's a flagship trade initiative of his and a key platform for future U.S. economic engagement in the Asia-Pacific region. Through the TPP, we are negotiating with Australia, Brunei, Malaysia, New Zealand, Singapore, Vietnam, Chile, and Peru to create a high-standard, broad-based regional trade agreement that addresses new and emerging issues in a way that harnesses the competitive strengths of the Asia-Pacific region. Over the past 18 months, we have made real and tangible progress. In fact, at the APEC meetings last November in Honolulu, President Obama and the 8 other TPP leaders announced the broad outlines of a TPP agreement and directed our negotiating teams to redouble their efforts to complete this agreement as soon as possible. The TPP countries have a shared goal, and that is to include additional countries beyond the current 9 in order to eventually incorporate a region that represents more than half of global output and more than 40% of world trade. Japan, Canada, and Mexico have already expressed interest in joining the TPP. At the appropriate time, TPP partners will determine by consensus whether to expand this agreement to admit new members. The Philippines is currently not participating in TPP, but I know that business leaders and government officials in the Philippines, like some other countries in the region, are looking at TPP with great interest. As your government continues to consider the prospect of pursuing potential membership in the TPP, the United States wants to be helpful. We have made that clear both privately and publicly. We are willing to provide our views on the kinds of commitments and policy reforms that would likely be required were the Philippines to join. Where we are able, we are willing to engage on joint initiatives that create important building blocks towards potential membership, like the recent trade facilitation agreement that we concluded last November. In addition, we are also considering how the Partnership for Growth can assist the Philippine government with supportive policy reforms. The notion that we must remember where we came from in order to get where we want to go seems as true for countries as it is for people. Let's remember and value our rich shared history as we work together to find our best path forward. Thanks again for having me here today, and I look forward to answering questions that you have.